Usually I talk about vampires on this channel, but today I want to pivot and talk about economics. In particular, the barter system. That's the system where goods and services and commodities are exchanged for other goods and commodities and services of a similar value. Very old economic system, and you know vampires don't like to barter. Vampires like to get something for nothing and give nothing in exchange. In fact, that might be one of the better, more useful definitions of what makes a vampire. Something that takes livelihood and gives nothing back. Because a lot of the other definitions aren't terribly useful. Not all vampires drink blood. Not all vampires are vulnerable to the sun. Not all vampires turn into bats. Almost always dead. Almost always dead. But almost always, in fact, take without giving back. So what's notable about today's economic lesson is one instance in the history of vamponomics where there was a gigantic lore swap, maybe the biggest in pop culture mythology, where vampires really did give something away to get something back. And who were their trading partners? Werewolves, would you believe?
There are werewolves involved for whatever reason.
Yes, this muttering of werewolves.
Vampires made a ginormous swap with werewolves. So let's pretend we're a financial news show and discuss this trade, except the stakes are way lower because you are not going to lose your life savings if you take my advice. You might just lose 7 minutes of your time. Let's start with silver. You know it, your mom wears it, the Hunt brothers took a bath on it in the 1980s. How do vampires react to it? You know the answer? Poorly. They react very poorly to silver. It tends to kill them or at least immobilize them. But if we take a look back in early vampire fiction, I'm talking 19th century, early 20th century, nary a mention of silver. Silver does not seem to be a factor in those early vampire stories. In fact, I saw a fascinating presentation by Robert Carlyle, who studied roughly 100 books from 19th, early 20th century, could not find a single mention of silver being something that vampires were vulnerable to. As it turns out, silver might be the newest invented weakness that vampires have. And where did they procure this? Well, according to Robert Carlyle, from werewolves. And it seems like werewolves discovered this thing as a weakness, and then vampires took it before werewolves really even had much of a chance to make it their own. Here's a few examples of some earlier stories where silver is used to destroy a werewolf. Not always a silver bullet, but silver in some fashion. Now, I'm not a werewolf guy. Have I read these stories? No. I've read the synopses. I've looked at the relevant parts. And yeah, I can verify for you that silver is used to get rid of werewolves in these stories. And these stories predate the use of silver to vanquish a vampire. Oh, hi, past Brian. It's future Brian. I'm sorry I had to edit myself in like this, but you were in the middle of saying something really dumb. Dumber than what you usually say. So I needed to stop you before everyone fact-checked you and ratioed you, which is a thing that can happen if you're a popular creator with lots of followers, I'm told. Anyway, what Robert Carlyle had said in his presentation last year is that the first instance he could find of a story using silver as a preventative measure against vampires was called The Silver Coffin from 1939. It was published in Weird Tales. And it uses silver not to kill a vampire, but to contain a vampire. And perhaps you can use context clues to sort out what object is used in a story called The Silver Coffin to contain a vampire. And if you can't, that's okay. We will wait here for you when you are ready to join us. The thing about it is, in The Silver Coffin, silver is hinted as being something that can kill a vampire, but it's not proven out in the canon of the story. We don't know if it really works or if it's just something the characters think that will work. So Robert Carlyle had said in his presentation last year that it wasn't until the 1940s where we get to see silver actually kill a vampire. And this, past Brian, is when you get to pick it back up. Now, I would like to have Robert Carlyle on this show sometime to talk about the history of silver and vampires because he knows his stuff, but I want to offer him one research note. Carlyle he's a professor of folklore and history, so he probably doesn't read a lot of comic books. So I'm gonna have to smack the nerd down here and say that there is a 1939 Batman story where silver is used to destroy a vampire. It's in Detective Comics number 32 from 1939. Speaking of evolving mythologies, we talk all the time on this channel about how vampires evolve. It's pretty common knowledge, right, that Batman doesn't kill and he doesn't use guns. Well, in 1939, not only did he use a gun with a silver bullet, but he killed a vampire while it was just sleeping. So Batman's morals have also evolved, along with werewolves and vampires. Whether it was Batman or some other obscure short story that first introduced the idea of silver being used against vampires, the point is, werewolves basically had the market cornered on silver until this upstart vampire mythology came along and tried to disrupt that by taking silver for being their own. But don't worry, the werewolves weren't completely shutted out because they did get something in exchange. Would you believe they gave werewolves the moon? Yeah, the moon, that silvery orb in the sky that makes humans turn into lichens. That was exclusively the domain of vampires in the 19th century. The first English language vampire, Lord Riven, he could be restored if his body was laid under a full moon. Same with the vampire in Planche's Vampire Bride of the Isles. And also the same with Varney the Vampire. If any of them were ever stabbed and bleeding out, all they had to do was have their bodies drug out under a full moon, and the next morning they were right as rain. The moon's restorative powers for vampires pretty much stops dead cold in 1897 when Dracula comes out. Because Dracula uses the moon for, mood setting, but it doesn't have like Deadpool level restoring powers for vampires anymore. And after Dracula, the moon basically vanishes from vampire fiction as being this thing that can restore vampires. Right about the time that vampires are getting out of the moon market, werewolves are getting into it. We start to see some short fiction in the early mid-20th century that makes use of the moon, but really where it really kicks in and gets cemented in the heads of the public is in cinema. Because just like cinema understood that the sun is a great way to kill a vampire, cinema also realized that the moon is a great way to turn a man into a wolf. Hey there, Future Brian here again with another important note. Werewolves are so often depicted as being men who turn into wolves that it is almost always overlooked that in the earliest werewolf poetry, and I'm talking from like the 1700s, werewolves are quite often women, old women. We discover this only after they are killed by whoever the hunters are. They take back their human form, which is quite often women. I don't know what you want to do with that information. Perhaps you want to write a comparative study. Perhaps you want to do a breakdown on, the genderizing of werewolves. I don't know, but when I learn things like this, which I didn't know before this project, I feel compelled to share them with somebody. So now we both know, and it's both of our problems, and I wish you luck on whatever you want to do with this info. There's a couple early silent short films about werewolves that are lost. I can't tell you whether the moon played a part in those, but by the time 1941's Wolfman rolls along, suddenly werewolves pretty much have a monopoly on the moon. So a barter was made. Moon for silver, silver for moon. And you know what the kick in the nards is over all this? Wolves don't even howl at the moon. In real life, wolves don't howl at the moon. And you know what happens when you shoot somebody with a silver bullet? The same thing that happens when you shoot them with a regular bullet. This is inexact lore, but it's mythology. So we roll with it, and it's fun to roll with it. It's also fun to kind of look and say, where did it come from and where did it start? And that's why we're here.
Where's the silver? Right here!
There's obviously a much deeper dive to be done here. We can and should be asking questions about what is it about the qualities of silver that make it a potent agent against the supernatural? We should be asking, what is it about the cycles of the moon that might make a man turn into a beast? Those are questions we should be discussing. I don't feel qualified to discuss those, but I do feel qualified to ask those questions to somebody who is in the know. So I'm going to work on getting guests on this show who can address those things. I have talked to Robert Carlyle. Maybe later this spring we're going to do an interview here. But I got a special treat for you in the meantime. On the next episode of Toothpickings, I'm going to sit down with Sean Rourke of the Vampire's Castle. He did an excellent presentation at the Children of the Night conference last year about the history of the vampire and werewolf war. If you pay attention to pop culture, you know what I'm talking about. The Lycans and the vampires being locked in this eternal struggle. Well, Sean and I are going to discuss the history of that and where it has gone. And more importantly, we are going to broker a peace deal between these two warring factions. I will be accepting my Cowbell Peace Prize as soon as I get done with my speech. And Sean, I think, will be joining me on that stage as we join hands with Lycans and vampires and try not to bite each other while we bring peace to this mythological world. In the meantime, stay safe, don't bite the hand that feeds you, and spray for fleas. Oh, you know what I should have done? I should have gotten one of those 3 wolf sweaters and worn that for this whole... I never think about these things till it's too late.